You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, this isn't our usual kind of video, but this one really grabbed my attention. So, it's being reported now that the Justice Department is appealing the sentences handed down for a number of the Proud Boys and the January 6 cases and these seditious conspiracy cases, meaning that the DOJ is seeking longer sentences than what were handed down. How unorthodox is this move?
This is extremely unorthodox and, frankly, a stone cold curiosity to this former career prosecutor, but a really important development. So here's what's going on. A group of defendants who are members of the Proud Boys organization went to trial. I sat in and watched some of the court proceedings in the case. They were convicted. Four of them were convicted of the lead count, seditious conspiracy. One was convicted of some lesser counts. And the sentences that they received were well below what the prosecutors asked the judge to impose. The sentences ranged from 10 years at the low end for the one who was not convicted of seditious conspiracy, but then 15 to 22 years for the worst offenders convicted of the greatest charge. And the chairman of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, got 22 years. But importantly, the prosecutors had asked for almost twice as much for all of the defendants. Enrique Tarrio, for example, they asked for 33 years. They only got 2/3 of that, 22 years. So now the Department of Justice has done something that is highly unusual. They have appealed what are lawful sentences. I never appealed a sentence in 30 years as a prosecutor. It can be done, but they're going to have to demonstrate that the judge was way out of bounds in giving what the prosecutors contend were unduly lenient sentences.
And what do you attribute this to? Is it the political affiliation, the partisan affiliation of the judge, or what would you imagine the reason being?
So, I don't think it has anything to do with party affiliation or with the fact that Judge Kelly, who presided over the Proud Boys trial, is a Trump appointee. I watched him. He did a fine job. I don't think it has anything to do with politics. I think there are two things potentially at play here. And Brian, let me hasten to add that the prosecutors filed what's called a notice of appeal, but all it says is we are contemplating appealing these sentences. So we call that a placeholder motion because there's a deadline by which they have to file their notice of appeal. But right now, we have no idea what the substance is, why the prosecutors may appeal these sentences. So we're engaging in some informed speculation here. I think there are two things possibly at play. One, the Proud Boys used violence to try to bring an end to our democracy. That's kind of a big ticket crime,
Yeah.
and it deserves a big ticket sentence, a big ticket punishment. So listen, the prosecutors would not have asked for 33 years for Enrique Tarrio if they didn't believe his crimes warranted 33 years in prison. So it may just be that they believe these sentences are not just and are not an accurate reflection of the severity of the crimes they committed. That's one thing that might be motivating the prosecutors. Here's the other, and maybe this is just me projecting my desire for equal justice for all. It may be that the Department of Justice is preparing to bring criminal charges against the hierarchy of the insurrection, the command structure of the insurrection, what I call the suits of the insurrection, not just the boots. They have been prosecuting by the hundreds, now approaching 1,200, and it is anticipated that they will bring as many as 1,800 criminal prosecutions of the boots of the insurrection, the people that Donald Trump set on the Capitol on January 6th to stop the certification of Joe Biden's win. But they haven't prosecuted a single solitary suit, hierarchy, command structure of the insurrection. And if they are about to bring those charges, or they anticipate they will bring those charges soon, they may be thinking, we're going to want even bigger numbers, longer sentences for the command structure of the insurrection. Everybody from Donald Trump on down, right? Some of the people who are now being prosecuted in the Georgia RICO case, for example. And because we're going to be asking for really big numbers for the generals of the insurrection, we need to ask for some larger numbers for the foot soldiers of the insurrection. So it may be that the Department of Justice and the prosecutors are viewing this sort of in an overarching way and trying to accomplish something greater than just increasing the sentences for each individual Proud Boy.
Okay. With that said, just on paper, would a sentence below the sentencing guidelines be adequate justification for an appeal here? Is that enough of a rationale to do so?
It's a great question. The answer is generally no. So the federal sentencing guidelines used to be mandatory. It used to be the judge could not lawfully depart from the sentencing guidelines. Congress passed them, and the law said you must sentence somebody within this particular range. But several years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that that was not constitutional, and they converted the sentencing guidelines from mandatory to discretionary. So now the judge's sentencing determinations are basically wide open. They are instructed to use the sentencing guidelines as precisely that, guidelines, but they can go above the guidelines if they choose. They can go below the guidelines if they choose. And that is some of what they did in the Proud Boys case. Now, if they go below the guidelines, they have to have sort of a rational reason to do so. But you know what? Any judge worth his or her salt will be able to articulate a rational reason for the sentence they imposed. So I think the prosecutors have an uphill climb trying to convince an appellate court that these sentences were so out of proportion to the offenses of conviction that an appellate court should step in and direct the trial court judge to up the sentencing ante. I think that is a very heavy lift for prosecutors.
Okay, now in the same way that the DOJ can and is appealing for a longer sentence, can the defendants here appeal for a shorter one?
The defendants can appeal anything and everything they choose to appeal. Here's what they will do. They have all filed their notices of appeal. And let me just tell you, as a former career prosecutor, every convicted defendant files a notice of appeal. They may end up filing a substantive appeal or not, but they preserve that right, just like the prosecutors just filed their notice of appeal to preserve the right to file an appeal. And here's the thing. If a defendant is convicted and their defense attorney does not file a notice of appeal and preserve their right to appeal, then instantly the client will turn on the attorney and file what's called an ineffective assistance of counsel claim because you failed to file my notice of appeal or my appeal. So yes, the Proud Boys, every defendant who is convicted as part of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th will file a notice of appeal, and they will try to appeal every issue under the sun. That's the way criminal appeals typically play out. A defendant will raise all of the possible issues, including a sentencing issue, hoping that one or more of these issues might catch the interest of the appellate court judges and lead to some kind of relief to the convicted defendant. The best of all worlds for them is that there's an issue that so undermined the fairness of the trial that the appellate court reverses the conviction and sends it back to the trial court for a new trial.
Okay, now this is something that you touched upon before, but does this say anything about how the DOJ will be approaching its prosecution of Donald Trump? I mean, you spoke about the suits here and how this this sentencing may impact how they're going to go after the suits, but Donald Trump is at the top of the food chain here. So what does this say about how they'll be approaching his prosecution?
It's a great question. Everybody who's wearing a suit between Donald Trump and the foot soldiers, and there are lots of them, people like Mark Meadows and Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani and on and on and on. All of those suit wearers, all of those members of the hierarchy of the insurrection have gone unaccountable, unpunished, unindicted thus far. But with respect to how Jack Smith might be approaching the Donald Trump prosecution, I don't think the J6 prosecutions of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, or anybody else who basically followed Donald Trump's commands on January 6th and attacked the Capitol, I don't think it will have much of an impact on the trial itself. But come sentencing time, it might be that they're going to look for a sentence of life without the possibility of release. Now, given Donald Trump's age, that's obviously not going to be 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Because he's already up there, and virtually any sentence to incarceration for a number of years would kind of end up being the equivalent of a life sentence for somebody of Donald Trump's age. But it may be that they want to preserve the ability to argue at Donald Trump's sentencing in the event of a conviction at trial, and I believe he will be convicted based on the overwhelming evidence, that they're going to look back and say, well, Judge, we insisted on really stern, severe sentences for the Proud Boys and others. Therefore, we are asking for something equally severe and significant for Donald Trump, because he was the one, in a very real sense, directing the movements of the Proud Boys on January 6th. So there may be some relationship to the appeals that we're seeing now of the Proud Boys sentences and what Jack Smith is going to want to do in the future with respect to Donald Trump and the other suits of the insurrection.
To that point, and let's finish off with this. I know that in the January 6th case that's being brought by Jack Smith in Washington, D.C., we didn't see any of these sedition charges or insurrection charges or anything like that. And we've spoken about that. And it was basically, you'd mentioned how Jack Smith didn't want to undermine any of his more surefire charges by putting charges up there that were less of a home run, because then that would kind of take away from the legitimacy of the charges that were already there. With that said, is it possible, given all of these convictions that we've seen for the Proud Boys, for all of the people who basically took their orders from Donald Trump, that after these prosecutions are finished, the ones in Washington, D.C., and the rest of his prosecutions that he's contending with right now, that we could then see further charges be brought forward, basically charging him as the top of the food chain here with these sedition charges that we're seeing with the Proud Boys right now?
The answer is it's possible, but I think it extremely unlikely. I think Jack Smith brought his 4 strongest charges. He didn't bring seditious conspiracy, and there is a distinction between the Proud Boys, which is already an organization and by and large a criminal organization, which is part of what you have to prove if you're going to bring conspiracy charges. Them acting in a conspiracy and attacking the Capitol, being motivated by or directed by Donald Trump, that doesn't necessarily, in a legal sense, make Donald Trump a member of that conspiracy. So I think Jack Smith probably was wise not to bring seditious conspiracy charges. I do have a disagreement with his decision not to bring insurrection charges, because I think Donald Trump clearly incited, engaged in, and gave aid and comfort to the insurrection and the insurrectionists. But Jack Smith probably wanted to sidestep the First Amendment challenges to Donald Trump's, violence inciting speech on the ellipse on the morning of January 6th. And listen, I'm not behind the curtain anymore at the Department of Justice, so I don't know the evidence that went in to these tactical decisions and these charging decisions by Jack Smith and his team of prosecutors. But I do think he went with the 4 strongest charges that are bulletproof, that will be easily proven beyond a reasonable doubt in court. And I think he's putting his best legal foot forward.
Okay, well, obviously, with that said, we'll stay on top of all of this stuff, including if any sentences change with any of these Proud Boys. So if you want to stay on top of everything, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.